Hello there, this is Hidde, and I'm honored to be here at Full Stack Utrecht and present you today about some ways to make your website more accessible. Let's see, do I have slides? Yes. So this talk is called 6 Ways to Make Your Site More Accessible, and it goes into kind of the things that I've come across as a front-end developer and as someone who's worked with front-end development for quite some time, specializing in web accessibility. I do this for all sorts of different companies, including Mozilla, W3C, the Dutch government, a bunch of different gemeenten in the Netherlands. And I'm actually particularly excited to be in Utrecht, virtually anyway, because I went to university there and lived in Utrecht for quite a couple of years. This talk is all about accessibility, and before we get into the webby stuff, let's chat a bit about what happens in the real world. Because in the real world, we have a lot of accessibility stuff that we take for granted, and that makes all sorts of sense to do. Like this elevator that is in a train station, in this case in Rotterdam. And the great thing about elevators is that they allow more people to access a service, in this case the train service. It allows people with suitcases, people with young children in strollers, even people who are using a wheelchair to access the train service in a way that they could not normally do if they were just given some stairs, because these people can't walk the stairs because of all sorts of different reasons. We make sure that they can because we want these people to use these services. Doing web accessibility is kind of that, but on the web. You're making sure that the web really works for people with disabilities and lots of people beyond that as well. The great thing about the web is that it is accessible by default. This is a great kind of technical thing to know, and it makes our life as developer easier. But it's also a promise that we kind of need to help fulfill. When the World Wide Web was invented, very soon after, accessibility was put at the front and center by the W3C. And the inventor of the World Wide Web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, when he was at the London Olympics opening ceremony, he made these 4 words appear. This is for everyone, which of course apply to the World Wide Web. He said this is for everyone, and this could be interpreted in various ways. For instance, that everyone can have their own website. The web wasn't designed in a way that you need to go to some government agency, apply for a website permit, and then 2 years later you'll be granted one. No, everyone can kind of create an HTML file, upload it to a server, and make it available on a URL. This is for everyone. The same goes for accessing the web. So you don't need to pay in order to use most of the web anyway. This changes a bit with video on demand services and stuff like that. There are some paid services out there, but in general, the web is a resource that is available for everyone broadly. And then lastly, the web works for everyone, at least that's the idea behind it. So it has lots of stuff built in to make the web work for people with disabilities. And today we'll talk about a lot of those things and what you can do as a developer to fulfill that ideal for the web. Now these 6 ways are all things that I've come across, as I said, working as an accessibility consultant and working as a front-end developer. They're all kind of front-end and development heavy. So there's also lots of things that your designer friends and your content friends need to take care of. But these are things that you can do as a front-end developer or as someone who works on the front end. Well, let's start with the first one. Expose names. Now, exposing names is something you do for people who use assistive technologies. And assistive technologies are bits of technology that allow people to use the web in ways that are kind of less than traditional, but that make it really work for their specific situation. So for instance, someone who is blind might understand Braille. So there is this Braille bar that you can attach to a computer, and it will in real time translate what happens on the screen into Braille. So you can feel with your fingers, and it will have this tactile feedback, and you can then understand what's going on the web page. There's things like screen readers that will read out everything that happens on the web page to you, so that you can understand it if you cannot see it. And there's a whole bunch of other assistive technologies. So a lot of the things we talk about today are about making sure your web page is compatible with these technologies. Most people think in terms of browser compatibility, but assistive technology compatibility is just as important. So when you send markup to the browser, it's going to generate a bunch of trees. The one that everyone is probably familiar with is the DOM tree. Now the DOM tree is a representation of your web page, so of the HTML that you've sent to the client, and it's kind of a tree view based off that. So it may have corrected some of the mistakes you've made. If you've forgotten to close an element, or you're starting with an H1 and ending with an H2, it happens to the best. The DOM tree is going to take care of that as well, and it'll kind of make sure that it is all one kind of consistent thing that the browser can work with and that you can work with in your JavaScript as well. So the DOM tree is there. Many people are aware of that, but what most people don't know is that there is a second tree, which is the accessibility tree. It gets generated on demand, so if someone uses a particular piece of technology, or if they open the accessibility tab in their browser, in this case I've got Firefox open, and in the accessibility tree you'll find things like roles, names, and properties. And these are all kind of accessibility related bits of meta information. And as a developer, you have a lot of control over what happens in that tree and what ends up in that tree. You could say that the accessibility tree is kind of how your page gets exposed to assistive technology. So it's really important to be aware of it and to make sure you optimize for it. Now, to explain a bit more about that. So, as I said, some people use assistive tag to browse the web. They usually have that tag themselves, so we don't need to do much as developers to make sure that tag exists in the first place, because it's there and users will come to your website using this technology. So we don't really need to worry about the tag itself, but we do need to make sure that the tag gets properly informed. Now, it gets this information about what happens on the screen from platform APIs. These are built into platforms like your Windows, Macintosh, Linux, also on mobile phones. They all have accessibility APIs that are able to tell assistive tag about what's happening in the user interface. So it tells them about things like, someone has opened this window, or they've opened their browser and they've clicked the favorites menu, or they've right-clicked and these are the options that are available. That sort of thing. Everything that happens on the platform is known by the platform APIs and exposed to assistive tag through them. Now, if someone goes to your website, maybe the platform APIs know what the browser is and the URL bar, and that works fine. But as soon as your website loads, they have no clue what that is, because you've built it and they've probably never seen it before. Now, for this reason, the browsers have these accessibility trees. Because the accessibility tree is aware of what's happening on your web page, and it tells the platform APIs, which then tell the assistive tag. So the accessibility tree is really crucial in this process. Now, as I said before, it is based on the DOM tree, which is itself based on the markup that you send to the browser. So by writing the right markup, we can really influence how well our website is usable with assistive tag. So that's why in this talk, I'll be talking quite a bit about markup, because it is quite important in this process. Now, by now you might be wondering, where can I find the accessibility tree? Luckily, in recent years, all of the big browsers have implemented accessibility trees in their DevTools, so that you can actually look at them as a developer. So for instance, in Firefox, there's a separate tab for accessibility. In Chrome and Edge, this information exists alongside the DOM information. You may have to look for it a bit, but ultimately you'll be able to find the information right there. Now, as I said, this is about naming. This chapter was called Expose Names. So let's think about naming for a bit. Now, as a young father, I'm quite aware, if you get a child, if everything goes well, you have to go to the city hall, at least you do in the Netherlands, and tell them that, a child was born and also what the name of this child is. So naming is your job. As a parent, you need to figure out what you're going to name your child. Now, what if you name your child Alice and the second one is born and you decide to name the second one Alice as well? and then the third is born, and a fourth, and you kind of decide, let's name all of them Alice. Can you imagine the sort of problem that this will cause? For one, there will be lots of communication issues, like, you're cooking and you're shouting to one of your kids, hey Alice, come help. They'll all show up, or maybe none of them will. If the school calls and one of your children has misbehaved, and they say, to Alice, it's really hard to figure out which one of your children has misbehaved. In other words, it's really annoying, right? If all your children are named Alice, it's not going to work. Now, this is something we do on the web quite a bit, because when we do something like this, where we have 4 paragraphs that all have a link right underneath them that says read more, we basically do that. We have 4 different links and they're all named read more. And it makes it really hard to distinguish between these links. This isn't so difficult when you're a sighted user and you're looking at the web page, because you can figure out from the context that they all kind of go to different places. But if you're a blind user and you're using a screen reader, you have this little menu that lets you pull up a list of all the links. So it's going to let you pull up the links, and it's going to say there's 4 links on this page, and they are read more, read more, read more, and read more. Now, this is really difficult because then you don't know where each one is going to go, and you have to go to each of them to figure out what the location is for these URLs. So you're going to figure out what these pages are by clicking on them, and that's really annoying. And it's something we can avoid by making sure that these links have unique names that describe what's on the link destination. So whenever you use an anchor tag, you're basically naming a link. That's a good one to remember. So when you're naming a link, you want to make sure that it has a name that makes sense if you hear it out of context. So if a screen reader is going to read out a list of links, then it's helpful if each link has a name that is instantly recognizable and makes sense out of context. So not read more, but something else. And this is a real thing. When WebAIM, which is a group from the US, they did research and they published that as the WebAIM Million, where they looked at top web pages that are out there, I think 1 million web pages, hence the name. And they found that 25% of them had links with ambiguous names like continue or read more. So that's a really big problem on the web, and sort of easy to solve, because the only thing that you need to do is make sure that you have link tags that make sense out of context. Similarly, a label tag names a form field. So whenever you use a form field, you want to use a label tag to make sure that that form field has a unique name. So again, in the WebAIM Million, they said that 60% of inputs were not properly labeled. So it's a really big issue. And what happens on a screen reader is that it's going to read out, here's an input, but it's not going to say what the input is for. If you have something like this, so I have an input for the name, and I have a div right in front of it with the text name in it. If you're a sighted user and you can see this, then that makes sense probably, because the word name is there, so you probably have to input a name there. Cool, makes sense. But if you cannot see this, then your screen reader is going to say, here's an input for text, and you don't know what the input is for. Now, to solve that, you want to make sure you use a label tag that is associated with the ID of the input. So you do that by making sure that the for attribute on the label is the same as the ID attribute on the input. Now, similarly, there's caption and legend. A caption labels a table, and a legend labels a form. Now, if you are a bookkeeper or an accountant, and I actually know someone who was an intern at one of the big firms, I think PwC, he was blind, and when you have to look through different financial results and they're all in tables, let's say you have a page that has 4 different tables on them, it makes sense to make sure that they all have different captions so that they're easy to distinguish. That's your goal here. So the content of that caption tag, you want to make sure that that's something recognizable. If I would give you a list of all the captions, you should be able to figure out what each table is. So maybe one is for the 2018 results and one is for the 2019 results. And that's the factor that really distinguishes these 2 tables. So the field set element is there to group a bunch of form fields, and then you can name that field set with a legend. Now the second part is about choosing your markup. It's one of the best things you can do for web accessibility as a front-end developer. Really make sure that you're using the right HTML tags. One thing that I see a lot in websites is that there is some confusion between the anchor tag and the button tag. Now the difference is really simple. The anchor tag goes somewhere and the button does something. So whenever you go to a different page, that should be an anchor tag. And if you find out that your href attribute on the anchor is empty, then usually that's an indication that you probably wanted to use a button tag instead, because the button is something that allows you to do an action on the web page. So if you have a close button or a save button or maybe a next or previous button in a carousel, that's usually a button tag. Never a div or a span or anything like that. It should be either an anchor or a button if you can do something with it. Now using a button for something like save comes with a lot of benefits for free. For instance, you can tab to a button. Buttons work with keyboard, which means you can press enter and submit or activate them. They're announced as buttons by screen readers. They are announced as buttons by screen readers, and they get the correct cursor. So all of that is built in for free. You can do all of that with a div, but it's much easier to use a button because that has all that stuff built in to it. And styling a button with CSS isn't as hard as it used to be, and not as hard as they say. There's a couple of CSS declarations that you'll need to apply, but generally it is quite easy to style a button element however you like it. If you're in doubt about which HTML element to use, I can recommend developers.whatworkinggroup.org. This is the specification for HTML and is also used by browsers to figure out how to implement HTML. But the developer edition has all the browser stuff taken out, so it has only the stuff that's relevant for developers. So that's perfect. I often use this to look up what an element is for and how I'm supposed to use it. So it has lots of very good information and good examples of how to use HTML. It's the quickest way to find out and much better information than a website like W3 Schools that often shows up on Google. Now the third tip I have is to provide structure in your HTML document. It's something that makes your site a lot more helpful for users of assistive technology. Now one way to provide structure is to give a title to your page that is relevant and timely and unique. So title is that element that you find in the head, and often when you do web development you don't really touch it because it's part of some generic template that you don't really do anything with. But it is really important that the title tag shows up in the browser with something that is very relevant. When I watched a video by Leonie Watson, who is an accessibility expert and a screen reader user herself, she said that the title is the first guarantee for her, a confirmation that she's ended up on the page that she wanted to end up on. So it tells her, right, I'm on the page I wanted to go to, because it gets read out when you go to a new page. So when you arrive at a page, whether you've come from somewhere else or you open a new tab, the screen reader is going to read out the title element. So make sure that it has some content that really explains what is on this current page and what is unique about it. Now, headings are another way to really provide good structure, and one way I like to see them is as a table of contents for assistive technology. The reason for that is that in a screen reader you can pull up this menu that allows you to see all the headings that are on the page. And this is actually a method to navigate web pages that is used by blind users quite a lot. You know, they have the option to read out the whole web page to them, but just as people who are sighted don't read the whole web page to figure out what's going on, someone who cannot see will not want to hear the whole web page. So a heading really provides a shortcut. It gives you a list of headings, and it will let you jump right to that heading. So in that sense, it is a bit like a table of contents. So make sure whenever you use an element that starts with H, like H1, H2, H3, make sure it has content that you could jump to, that makes sense as a title for a section. And if you don't have that, so if maybe you're using an H2 for something that doesn't really describe a section, consider using something completely different. Maybe put it in a div instead. Because if you use a H element, you want to make sure that it is something that people can jump to and that kind of explains what's in a given section. Something else that I always recommend is to have a sensible HTML structure. And what I do when I test websites for accessibility is that I turn off the CSS to see what the structure looks like, the bare, naked structure. People do this on CSS Naked Day, if you're familiar with that. That's a day a year where websites serve their website without CSS, just to figure out what the structure looks like. And if your structure is good, it will work quite well without CSS. So turn off the CSS to figure out if you have a sensible HTML structure and if the order in your HTML makes sense. The fourth tip I have for you today is to specify language. And this is something that you do in the HTML element for the document. So the whole page gets specified there with a lang attribute, and you put in the shortcode for the language. So if the web page is in English, you do lang equals en, and that tells the browser that all of the content in the web page is in that language. This gets used by a variety of things, including screen readers, to figure out which voice to use. If you have, maybe you're a Dutch screen reader user, you have a Dutch voice as well as an English voice installed, then it can switch between those voices based on the language that is specified. Now it could be the case that some parts of your web page are in a different language. Maybe you have a name that is in Spanish, then you can also specify that by adding a span element and saying this span is in this language. If you have translations, you can also use the related reflang attribute, and that kind of specifies what the web page that you're linking to is in. So in this case, I have a link to the Chinese version of this web page, and reflang is telling the user that this page is in the Chinese language. So maybe it can already preload the voice for that, or do something else clever with that information. If you write in Chinese that this is the Chinese version, then you can also combine it with the lang attribute to say the link name is also in Chinese. So the page that you're linking to is in Chinese, and also the link itself is written in Chinese. So you can combine reflang and lang in one element if you wanted to. So tip number 5, it's about text alternatives. When a blind friend of mine told me about supermarket visits, he explained that she always has to get some help, like she has to ask an assistant in the supermarket or bring her husband with her, just in order to figure out basic stuff like how much sugar is in this ketchup, or what's on special this week, where do I find the avocados. These kind of things she couldn't find out. And this made her really happy with the supermarket's website, because on the website she was able to figure out all of those things by herself. And the reason for that is that the web is mostly text. The web is really a big opportunity for people who are blind, because when they're in the real world, they might need an assistant to figure out what stuff is. If they're on the web, they're able to use the text that is on the web page, as long as the text is specified properly by web developers like ourselves. So this is where we can really make a big difference for people who cannot see the web page. The web is mostly text, so that makes it really good for web accessibility, because you can select text, you can copy paste text, you can make it larger. It works for screen readers, it is Google translatable. All of those things are making sure that the web lets us have a lot of accessibility automatically. Because we specify it in text, all this software can then automatically do useful stuff for users. So that is really good. This is why it's so important that we use text everywhere. And it's also important, if you don't have text, to make sure that there are text alternatives. For instance, if you have an image that says 30% of your next purchase, and this image was particularly difficult to put in text because of the font was very expensive or something like that, you decided to put it in an image, really make sure that that alt attribute has the contents of the image in it, so that everyone can enjoy that discount and is aware of it. Google announced last year at CSUN conference that they are working on something for Chrome that lets people have automated image captions when an image doesn't have alternative text. Well, this is really cool, and they are using AI for this. It's really cool to have automated stuff there, but it's also really hard to get right. And so far, the AI-powered alternative text that we've seen is just not as good as what humans have been able to come up with. And that's because a lot of this is very context sensitive. For instance, if you have a list of people who work in your company and they have photos, then usually you don't want alternative text with the photos because the name of the people is already in the content. So you've specified the names in text already. The images are kind of decorative with the text. If you'd have alternative text there, you'd have the same names twice. Basically, it really depends on the context, and the context is something that is very hard to guess for AI. AI is notoriously bad at figuring out context. Now, alternative text is also something you can do with audio and video elements. For instance, on the Frontiers website, we have these videos from our conference talks. And the cool thing here that we've done is have the full transcript of the video typed out. And you can click on parts of that to go to the right part of the video. This is helpful if you've Googled this video by Matthias Binance and you want to figure out what exactly he says about optimizing images. So you can use Ctrl+F in your browser, find the right part, and then click it. So you can do all sorts of cool things with that as well. The last thing I wanted to say is that it is really important to test with a keyboard. That again is something that can really make your web page a lot better for people with disabilities. Keyboard usage on web pages is something that really happens between the interactive elements. So this is a specific set of elements that are activatable by keyboard. It's things like the input elements, like things in forms, anchors, text areas, buttons, those kind of things, the details element. All of these things, they are interactive elements. They are supposed to be usable with a keyboard, unless you've done something like outline none in your style sheet. But outline none is something that is really bad. People who don't use a mouse, they use focus styles to figure out where they are. So let's say we have a bunch of text with some links in it. The way that you will know which link you're about to click if you're using a mouse is simply because that is the one that your mouse cursor is hovering above. That's how you know I'm about to click this link, collaborative thinking. So the mouse cursor is helping you there. Now, if you don't have a mouse cursor, you can't see that. So you'd have to have something that replaces that, and that's what kind of focus outlines are for. They draw a box around the link text so that you know that you're currently on that part of the content. If you think these are ugly, or if you work with designers who say, I don't want to see that focus outline, I don't want to see it because it is ugly, then tell them, streetlights are also ugly, but they help you see where you are in the dark. If you walk home, they're just extremely helpful. We could turn them off because they're ugly, but then you wouldn't be able to see where you are. And that's the same thing for links in web pages. If you don't have focus styles, you cannot see where you are if you're not using a mouse. And there are lots of people that don't use a mouse for all sorts of reasons. Or as Laura Cafagel beautifully put it at Frontiers a couple of years ago, you wouldn't steal their cursor. You wouldn't do cursor none in your CSS to get rid of someone's cursor, which actually you can do in CSS. You can get rid of the cursor so that people cannot see where they are. You wouldn't do that. No one would. So don't get rid of the focus outlines either, because they are really important. And just one thing, if you're testing a web page, is make sure that you can get to all the links and all the buttons and all the forms with just a keyboard. So these are the 6 things that I wanted to get to today. Make sure you have good accessible names, and whenever you use one of those naming elements that I talked about, make sure that they are useful names. There's markup that's really important, so make sure you're really aware of the HTML standard and what is possible with it, and use the right element for the job. Make sure you put in a lot of structure with good heading elements and titles. Always define your language, have text alternatives, and make sure that everything works with keyboard just as well as it works with a mouse. So these are my 6 things. I am really looking forward to hearing some of your feedback. I'll be showing up for a live Q&A after this. For now, I want to tell you that the slides are available on Noticed. So that's on my website, talks.hiddendevries.nl. And you can follow me on Twitter at HDV. Now, thanks very much for attending today. Thanks for making the time. And I look forward to answering your questions in the Q&A right after this.